Okay, good afternoon. This talk is based on a lecture that I gave in Annapolis in 1998. It's been revised, especially toward the end. If I revisit it again in another quarter century, it'll probably change again. Hope you can come. In 1536, Pierre de la Ramée, in Latin Petrus Ramus, stood before the arts faculty of the University of Paris as a candidate for the degree of Master of Arts. He had come to defend a provocative thesis, quaecumque ab Aristotele dicta essent commentitia esse, which is to say, everything Aristotle has said is wrong. I wish I could tell you what Ramus said in defense of this reckless claim. Unfortunately, the master's thesis in that time was not a research paper or a written essay as it is today. It was simply a proposition or a statement that the candidate expounded orally. Moreover, at least one historian claims that Ramus's thesis was not quite so alarming as it sounds to modern ears, and that the story has been inflated and embroidered by what he called lovers of partisan histrionics. But even if Ramus did not actually refute every statement of Aristotle in a single afternoon, his story still caught the imagination of that age. Ramus's thesis took the aspect of a myth, a new myth, a modern myth, depicting a young, brash hero setting out to challenge alone, not a dragon or a monster, but the weight of entrenched authority. As such, he was made to stand alongside other icons of early modern rebellion. Giordano Bruno, burned for claiming that the universe was infinite. Luther, nailing 95 theses to a church door. Galileo, browbeaten into public confession that the earth was stationary, but whispering to himself, yet it moves. In the 16th century, Aristotle still appeared to many, actually to be what Thomas Aquinas had called him, the philosopher. His works had a weight that could not be lightly ignored. But with Ramus, there begins a torrent of violent anti-Aristotelian sentiment. Bacon classified Aristotle and Plato as sophists. Oh. Let's go. There we go. Sorry. Sophists. And says that their systems, like planks of lighter and less solid material, floated on the waves of time, while the more substantial doctrines of the atomists sank and were lost. Luther calls Aristotle, quote, that buffoon who has always misled the church. Hobbes names him the worst teacher that ever was, and refers to his doctrines as insignificant speech. I could go on in this vein. The question that the figure of Ramus presents is especially vital to us here at St. John's. In its historical guise, it might be called the question of the origins of modernity. It asks, did something happen between the 13th century and the 16th century that explains the move from Thomas's acceptance of Aristotelian thought to the moderns' dismissal of it? We at St. John's pride ourselves on paying more attention and respect and listening with more care to Aristotle and to other ancient authors than do many, perhaps any other schools. Our decision to treat those texts with such respect began as an act of defiance against prevailing trends in education, and the St. John's College program still stands in sharp contrast, if not hostile opposition, to the mainstream of academic institutions. Consequently, it is not surprising that the rejection of ancient authority displayed by early modern authors like Hobbes, Bacon, and Galileo has concerned us from the founding of the new program. The various understandings of this rebellious spirit of modernity are so diverse that I have found it helpful to impose on them a little taxonomy. To begin with, there are some historians who question whether modernity really constitutes an important shift that requires explanation. Among historians of science, there is an ongoing controversy known as the continuity debate concerning whether scientific achievements of the 16th and 17th century should be seen as an outgrowth and continuation of medieval science or as something revolutionary and novel. In general, if you look for precursors, you will find them. So, for example, Archimedes worked on limits long before Newton and Leibniz. Nicolo Rem had come up with a time-squared rule for falling bodies in the 14th century, long before Galileo was born. Those scholars then who deny that the beginning of modernity of the modern age, the 17th century perhaps, constituted a fundamental shift in thought, I classify together as the shiftless. The opponents of the shiftless, that is to say, those who take more seriously the difference between the ancients and the moderns, we can call the shifty. The shifty are a diverse group embracing a wide variety of different views. We can sort them out according to whether their fundamental allegiances lie with the ancients, with the moderns, with neither, or with both. We arrive, therefore, at a fourfold division. First, those who believe that there was a shift and the moderns were right, the shifty moderns. Second, those who believe there was a shift and the ancients were right, the shifty ancients. Next, those who believe there was a shift and neither the ancients nor the moderns were right, the shifty exclusives. And those who believe that there was a shift and both the ancients and the moderns were right, the shifty inclusives. We'll go through them one at a time. The first group, the shifty moderns, is the easiest to identify. It includes the founding fathers of the modern movement themselves. Bacon, Galileo, and Hobbes were plainly shifty. They all have believed that the work they were doing constituted a radical departure from what had gone before them. They conceived themselves to be innovators, and since their writings were polemical in nature, they did not generally accord a sympathetic understanding to their Aristotelian opponents. When Galileo demolishes Aristotelian impetus theory or mocks the idea that heavier stones fall faster in proportion to their heaviness, he doesn't pause to consider what might have led Aristotle or his followers to adopt what Galileo himself considers to be obvious fallacies. Nor does Hobbes seem to reflect much on why Aristotle, whose works he knew very well, should have engaged in insignificant speech. All in all, the only explanation that these authors have for their own superiority is one that they seem too polite to pronounce baldly, that is, that those who came before them were fools. This explanation for the shortcomings of the ancients is not limited to the 16th and 17th century authors. Many recent writers have adopted the early moderns' breezy dismissal of Aristotle. Some of you have seen little introductory paragraphs in science textbooks that treat early natural philosophers with patronizing condescension. One example of this sort of thing that happened to be sitting on my bookshelf is Carl Sagan's Demon-Haunted World, which scoffs at Aristotle for, quote, seriously considering the contention that dreams are scripted by demons. The impression that Sagan leaves us with is that Aristotle was benighted, gullible, superstitious, and, in short, a fool. The second group are the shifty ancients. Those who say that there was a radical change in thought sometime in and around the 16th century, but who believe that the ancients were right and abandoning their teachings was an enormous mistake. A shining example of this view can be found in Aeterni Patris, Pope Leo XIII's 1879 encyclical urging Catholic scholars to the study of Thomas Aquinas. This document recognizes the widespread shift away from the truths of Thomism and deplores it. In the old days, that is in the 13th century, Thomas reigned supreme, and the minds of all, teachers as well as taught, rested in wonderful harmony under the shield and authority of the angelic doctor, close quote. By contrast to the peace of those times, the present, that is to say, the 19th century, is racked by what he calls bitter strifes, resulting from the false conclusions concerning divine and human things, which originated in the schools of philosophy, have now crept into all orders of the state and have been accepted by the common consent of the masses, close quote. The encyclical lays the blame for this degeneration on the moderns' unhealthy taste for innovation. Beginning in the 16th century, reckless philosophers, the encyclical does not name names, but presumably the moderns are meant, such as Bacon, Descartes, and Hobbes. Moderns, reckless philosophers have undertaken, quote, to build up a new edifice. However, because their conclusions differed and clashed with one another, their multiform system was open to change and consequently was not firm and stable and robust like that of old, but tottering and feeble. In likening the modern's writings to an unstable building, the encyclical invokes the image of the Tower of Babel and broadly implies that the motives for the modern's misguided actions was pride and a particularly vicious outburst of original sin. Aeterni Patris was not alone in its condemnation of the moderns as sinful deviants from the faith. There's no shortage of 20th century theologians, not only Catholics, but those who consider what they often call the Enlightenment or the Enlightenment project, with shades of suspicion ranging from distrust to loathing. Alistair MacIntyre, for example, a well-known 20th century philosopher, declares that, quote, one must hold that the Enlightenment project was not only mistaken, but should never have been commenced in the first place. Indeed, the shifty ancients are a fairly populous group, and we'll come back later to consider their role in the creation of the new program at St. John's College. The third group, the shifty exclusives, the puppets of history. The shifty exclusive is perhaps the most fun group. It includes those who believe that there was a radical shift between the ancients and the moderns, but who claim to have no essential allegiance to either the ancient or the modern party. In this category fall all those forms of explanation that set aside disbelief or simply ignore the truth or falsity of the claims made by the ancient and modern philosophers alike, and look instead at collateral factors to explain the shift from one way of thinking to another. Here's where we find all manner of social, economic, and technological determinists. Among the shifty exclusives, one finds, for example, Marxists, who contend that economic forces throw up philosophical rationalizations as byproducts that shouldn't themselves be taken seriously. Another shifty exclusive argument is the so-called Merton hypothesis in science, which begins with the observation that religious Puritanism is statistically overrepresented in the membership of the rolls of the English Royal Society in the 16th and 17th century, and proceeds to argue that religious nonconformism promotes scientific innovation. My personal favorite among the shifty exclusive theories is the technological determinism deriving from the works of Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan was a pop icon in the late 1960s. He has a cameo role in Woody Allen's movie Annie Hall. But he was also a professor of English literature and the author of an influential, if somewhat peculiar book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, in which he argues that the tremendous shift in 16th century European consciousness came about as the result of the introduction of movable type printing. This new technology not only made available cheap and plentiful books, but also introduced forms of visual regimentation, straight lines of mechanically reproduced type, that McLuhan claims were foreign to the preceding predominantly oral medieval culture. These changes led to, among other things, Ramism, that is, the pedagogic methods of Petrus Ramus, including the sort of categorization and diagrammatic dissection that I'm doing right now. McLuhan's whole enterprise is especially interesting because his thesis, that the media of communication crucially affects the content of what is communicated, can be shifted forward 400 years and applied to the present times when the printed word is being joined or supplanted by radio, telephone, television, cassettes, compact disc, answering machines, streaming services, pagers, email, videotapes, computers, virtual reality, and the internet. That was written in the 1990s. The list could have been made longer, but it wouldn't have been any more interesting. The appeal of these shifty exclusive arguments, and the reason why they're so much fun to read, is the feeling they provide of esoteric superiority. They give the reader the impression that he or she knows what happened in a given period of history better than the people who actually took part in it. If you read a book that explains that the advent of the printing press, or the kind of guild monopolies, or some change or in trade or financial practices, or the Protestant Reformation was what actually motivated the shift from ancient to modern thought, then you are in a position to understand that shift better than did Galileo or Descartes or any of the other participants in the events themselves, since all they were doing was innocently trying to describe the world as it appeared to them. The final group, the shifty inclusive, are those who believe that radical change took place in the advent of modernity themselves. Moreover, the enormous scope of Hegel's work gives it the additional pleasure of panoramic synopsis. This is the feeling of taking in a huge, sweeping stretch of time with a single view. It resembles the sensation one has looking down from the top of a very high mountain on the valley far below. The ability, whether genuine or imagined, to encompass centuries and millennia in a single motion of the mind brings with it an inflationary feeling of power that can be positively intoxicating for someone with the right sort of intellectual imagination. These, then, are the four shifties: ancient, modern, exclusive, and inclusive. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that shiftiness of some sort has played a role in the design of the St. John's curriculum. Almost any student who reaches the junior year will confirm that something has changed in the books that we read. Many might finger Descartes, as the person responsible for the change. Others might point to Bacon or Machiavelli. If there were any doubt of the influence of shiftiness, we need only to look at the college catalog, which straightforwardly states in its description of the laboratory program that René Descartes' introduction of algebra and analytic geometry into European thought was, quote, one of the great intellectual revolutions in recorded history. It is, the catalog says, a focal point of St. John's program and one which the college takes special care to emphasize. Revolution, whether intellectual or political, is inherently shifty. But what sort of shiftiness? Pretty clearly it's not shifty modernism. Whatever else we do at St. John's, we don't simply dismiss ancient authors with contempt. Nor do we engage in the sort of scholarship characteristic of the shifty exclusives. We don't look for social, political, or economic determinants for intellectual changes. In fact, if we turn back to the catalog for a moment, we find it saying that Descartes' intellectual revolution, quote, in part determined the other great revolutions in industry, politics, morals, and religion. The catalog pointedly does not suggest that the causation might have run in the other direction. There's no allowance for the possibility that industry, politics, and religion shape the intellect. Are we then shifty inclusives? Well, we do force our students to read selections from Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. Some might think that cruel. By the standards of our other colleges and universities, it is unusual. Some students make Professor Hegel their particular hero. I'm thinking of one student in my senior laboratory last year who missed no opportunity to turn discussion to his favorite philosopher. Ultimately, those efforts had no more success than did my sporadic, ill-conceived attempts to introduce James Joyce in our conversation. But in any event, Hegel's philosophy is not the official college doctrine. That leaves shifty ancientry. And indeed, some of the college's critics attack the backward-looking emphasis that is baked into our curriculum, just as some of our supporters applaud it. It's not hard to find voices at the college that will argue that modernity, broadly understood as beginning with Machiavelli, Bacon, or Newton, represented a philosophical wrong turn. However, although our spirit of open-mindedness gives these voices a place at the college, it is not institutionally dedicated to shifty ancientry. We could hardly devote as much time and energy as we do to Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, and Einstein, not to mention Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Adam Smith, and Nietzsche, to name just a few, just as an exercise in knowing your enemy. So which is it then? What kind of shiftiness is it? Is it a kind of shiftiness? I think here we find a flaw in our process of discovery by elimination, because it turns out that there is one other category that our table missed, and that is closer to St. John's implicit doctrinal commitment. The ahistoricals. The timeless value that many ascribe to the great books suggests that we need to add another category alongside the shiftless and the four kinds of shifties. The last group are the ahistoricals. Their strategy is to ignore or deny the significance of history altogether. It's not a shifty position exactly, because there cannot be shifts outside of time. It's not shiftless either, since the shiftless do not deny that important changes take place in time, but only that there are sudden and unanticipated leaps. The ahistorical position, which I'm coming increasingly to believe is the college's real stance, is that the truly interesting and significant questions occur outside of time. Alan Bloom illustrates this view vividly in a story about a young Chicago great books student who surprised his seminar leader by referring in conversation to Mr. Aristotle. The student was apparently unaware that Aristotle was not a contemporary. According to Bloom, the professor was not appalled by the student's ignorance, but rather delighted by his naive intellectual vitality. The ahistoricals rise serenely above the issue of the origins of modernity. In this way of thinking, Descartes does not follow St. Thomas, and Aristotle does not precede Hobbes, except in accidental and unimportant ways. All of them are part of a single great conversation, and the contributions of each are worthy of consideration on their own merits and without regard to their placement in any historical setting or sequence. Of course, there are different positions within this great conversation, but the differences do not come about because one author follows or precedes another temporally. Since the themes of the conversation are eternal, we expect, and we almost always find, that later authors are restating and amplifying ideas that had already been introduced earlier in the conversation, usually by Plato, to whom all philosophy is, after all, a series of footnotes. From the ahistorical perspective, the shift that we have been discussing, from respectful deference to Aristotelian philosophy to the violent innovation of early modern materialists, should not be understood as merely one instance of an archetypal discussion, should be understood as merely one instance of an archetypal discussion that's been present from the beginning of philosophy. Joe Sachs, a colleague in Annapolis, in a lecture delivered in 1992, identified the difference between the modern scientific views and the views of Aristotle as the battle of the gods and the giants. The gigantomachia, which is referenced in Plato's Sophist. In that dialogue, the Eleatic stranger says that an argument that he and Theaetetus have come across resembles the legendary war between the gods, who believe that true reality consists of intelligible and bodiless forms, and an opposing group of giants who refuse to admit the reality of anything they cannot grasp with their hands. That interpretation of the advent of modernity as a version of a mythological, timeless debate epitomizes the historical precision. A lot of the rhetoric supporting St. John's College curriculum invokes the idea of timelessness. The catalog speaks of the books as both timeless and timely. J. Winfrey Smith, in his History of the College, states flatly that the origin of the new program has no interest in studying the past as past. Jacob Klein, dean in Annapolis, in a lecture entitled History in the Liberal Arts, freely acknowledges that St. John's students have a, quote, remarkable lack of historical awareness, and offers a principled defense of the college's decision to pay little attention to history. Our practice of deliberately ignoring or the setting or context in which our books are written depends on the assumption that their real significance is ahistorical or transhistorical. We do read a few works that are thought of as history: Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, Tacitus. Here in Santa Fe, sophomores read a little bit of Livy, but typically we treat them more or less as we treat literature. We have no way of evaluating the historical validity of anything that they say, nor do we have any occasion to compare two or more accounts of the same events in order to judge the comparative role of fact and interpretation. We will entertain, of course, an ahistorical discussion about history. We read Hegel's work, which advocates what I've called a shifty inclusive historiography, and Marx, who presents a shifty exclusive perspective. But the advocates of these views must bring them to the great timeless seminar table in the sky before the conversation can begin, and that presents an interesting problem. Historically minded giants might try to question the posture of godlike timelessness that the St. John's program adopts towards its books. But they're faced at the outset with what a lawyer might call an awkward choice of forum issue. We understand that the selection of the court in which a case can be tried sometimes is as important to the outcome as the substantive merits. The giants' doubts about whether any book can properly be treated ahistorically, divorced from its social and political context, lose much of their force as soon as they're brought to the St. John's seminar table, where they're expected to confront the ideas of Aristotle or of Hobbes as if they were contemporaries. Moreover, most of the evidence that such giants might wish to offer for their claims is deemed inadmissible at a St. John's seminar. Students here are not permitted, much less encouraged, to collect and ponder the historical factual material that might make the giants' arguments seem plausible. At St. John's College, the possibility that social, economic, or technological transformations might shape intellectual expression is never really considered, except in the abstract, because the students remain almost wholly ignorant of the social, economic, or technological setting of the works that they read. At St. John's, the gods win more or less by default. The matter would look different if we were to move the question into the giant's home court. That is, instead of asking for a timeless ahistorical justification for taking historical context into account when reading books, we might turn the question around 180 degrees and ask instead, what historical factors would give rise to the posture of ahistorical attachment from time, the sort that characterizes the St. John's program? If the giants are discomfited at the seminar table of the timeless gods, the gods' pretension of timelessness can appear equally unpersuasive when viewed from the giants' perspective. The posture of timeless ahistoricality is not itself timeless. It arose, at least arguably, in response to specific, identifiable social and political factors. The new program at St. John's College came into being over 80 years ago when Stringfellow Barr and Scott Buchanan brought to Annapolis an idea for liberal education that Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler had been trying unsuccessfully to institute at the University of Chicago. And whose roots can be traced further back to John Erskine's General Honors Program at the Columbia University in the years just after World War I. The historian's project is to interpret these facts. Several historians have offered interesting perspectives on the birth of the Great Books program. Joan Rubin, for instance, depicts John Erskine as responding to doubts about whether, quote, American consumer culture can sustain an adequate measure of civilization. Erskine's answer, according to Rubin, was to make the masterpieces of culture, those things that Matthew Arnold had called the best that has been thought and said in the world, into commodities, the great books, a consumer packaging of the essence of culture. From this perspective, the creation of the great books takes place alongside other middle-brow cultural programs, including Will Durant's Story of Philosophy and the Great Books and the Book of the Month Club. Another historian, Lawrence Levine, places Hutchins, Adler, and the advent of the new program in the context of other early 20th century programs, efforts to create courses in Western civilization. Levine argues that these programs had a dual purpose. Internally, they created a unifying and assimilative force to counteract the tensions introduced by, among other things, massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and the rise of hyphenated Americans. At the same time, internationally, they sought to reorient American self-perception away from that of a revolutionary upstart opposed to the interests of the great powers of Europe and toward that of the spiritual descendant and heir of the general Western culture, a move that was, in part, explicitly aimed at reconciling Americans to Woodrow Wilson's internationalism and the nation's involvement in the First World War. A third historical interpretation attributes the new program to a sequence of events that began with, and I'm not making this up, Nikolai Lobachevsky. According to Edward Purcell, the advent of non-Euclidean geometry profoundly undermined long-standing confidence in the ability of human reason to apprehend genuine, reliable truths. Our seniors have some idea how profound that disillusionment can be. Purcell marshals an impressive amount of evidence to describe how the success of non-Euclidean geometry acted as a powerful metaphor, inspiring thinkers in other fields to search for, quote, non-Euclidean possibilities in all lines of reasoning. Liberated from the confines or the discipline of reason's normative claims, anthropology, sociology, and economics applied the methods of natural sciences to human studies in ways that promoted ethical relativism at best and ethical nihilism at worst, with the result that by the 1930s, Purcell claims, most, quote, American intellectuals rejected the idea that any prescriptive ethical theory could possess rationally compelling authority. This attitude of moral rootlessness was troubling enough by itself, and it only became more worrisome with the rise of totalitarian governments in Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union, and the looming threat of the Second World War. According to Purcell, Robert Hutchins led the principal counterattack against this perceived confusion. Mortimer Adler was his lieutenant, and the great books was his weapon. From a strictly academic standpoint, the problem that Hutchins confronted was the elective system for undergraduate education, which seemed to strip the college curriculum as a whole of any identifiable purpose at all. In a highly publicized and much discussed series of lectures at Yale in 1935, Hutchins declared that, quote, "The free elective system amounts to a denial that there is any content to education." Hutchins thought that the modern university needed, quote, "a principle of unity to do for it what theology had done for the medieval universities." He was too much of a freethinker to advocate a return to theology. "We are a faithless generation," he declared, apparently without any regret, "and we take no stock in revelation." But he suggested that the American university should adopt as its guide the secular principle that had ruled over Greek thought, which he called metaphysics. As a practical reform, Hutchins recommended that the university undergraduate curriculum should consist of permanent studies revolving around the timeless conversation of the great books. Thus, Purcell saw Hutchins' call for the great books education as a reaction to the educational and social chaos created by non-Euclidean alternatives to rational moral theory. Finally, two other historians, Gerald Graff and Raymond Williams, placed Hutchins' call for a restoration of educational unity in a slightly different context, that of the centuries-old line of culturally conservative exhortations whose classic expression was Matthew Arnold's 1869 book, Culture and Anarchy. It was in this work that Arnold articulated his oft-quoted definition of culture as, quote, "the best that has been thought and said in the world." Arnold shares with Hutchins the desire to find some intellectual ideal that will replace theology as the stabilizing center for general education. Arnold's name for this unifying principle was culture. Culture, Arnold said, directed its followers toward greater perfection. It strives ever for, quote, "the two noblest of things, sweetness and light." Hutchins' ideal of liberal education echoes Arnold's culture in almost every important respect. Both Hutchins and Arnold thought of their ideals as Hellenic in origin. Both show a disregard or contempt for the interests of the commercial and mercantile segments of the population, whom Arnold referred to as Philistines. More importantly, Arnold and Hutchins stand together against a common foe, anarchy. To Hutchins, anarchy appeared generally in the form of blind and unthinking empiricism, and specifically in the directionless freedom of the elective system. Arnold saw it as the threat posed by political agitation of the English middle class, who maintained that the ancestral liberty of Englishmen consists in the freedom to do what he likes. Arnold thought that this idea was a regrettable mistake caused by the decay of earlier feudal institutions that had given freedom its real meaning. Arnold understood the ideal of culture to be frankly authoritarian. Its purpose was to provide a reliable standard of right reason that might direct and control discordant desires of what he called the raw person. Everyday selves, he tells us, are separate personal at war. They have no refuge from anarchy. Our best self, however, is the one which, quote, "culture or the study of perfection seeks to develop in us, and it's altogether different. By means of it, we are united, impersonal, and at harmony. We can entrust it with authority without fearing tyranny, because it is the truest friend that we all can have." In practice, Arnold argued strenuously for the maintenance of public order. Riots were especially deplorable, but he disapproved of all forms of unruliness, even in support of desirable causes, because in his mind, culture meant harmony, harmony required stability, and stability rested on authority. Hutchins did not view his own proposals as authoritarian, but others certainly saw them that way. His Yale lectures brought a firestorm of protest from all quarters, denouncing them as un-American, possibly totalitarian, conceivably fascist. The faculty of Hutchins' own university issued a manifesto calling his proposals a, quote, "reactionary course of accepting one system of ancient or medieval metaphysics and dialectic, whose adoption would, quote, spell disaster." American philosopher John Dewey condemned Hutchins' ideas as a form of philosophical absolutism that implied political authoritarianism. These four historical interpretations of our ahistorical perspective on the books are just a sampling of what's available. Rubin relates the great books to commercialization of culture. Levine derives them from the need to assimilate immigrants and move away from American isolationism. Purcell found the origins of the program in a search for stability and traditional meaning in the face of new scientific disciplines and totalitarian political threats. Graff and Williams place us in the tradition of cultural conservatism alongside Matthew Arnold. Each of these narratives is in the style that I've characterized as shifty exclusive. That is, they look for correlations and trends between social, economic, and intellectual phenomena without attempting to evaluate the validity of the positions expressed. That the timeless or ahistorical posture might be proper, right, or correct doesn't enter into their discussion because the participants, the giants and the gigantomachia, are not looking for truth, but influences, causes, effects, and contributing factors. Engagement with the great books asks us to wonder whether our collection of books is perhaps too neat, too packaged, and too much a commodity, as Rubin suggests. Are we inherently committed to a picture of Western ascendancy, popular at the time of Woodrow Wilson, but now open to question? Does our claim of timelessness for the great conversation among the authors of our program align the college, for better or for worse, with the authoritarian cultural conservatives like Matthew Arnold? At this point, what I would do is reach down and take a glass of water and take a sip from it in order to emphasize that this is a punctuation point. But they didn't provide me with a glass of water, which is probably a good thing because I undoubtedly spilled it on the computer. So pretend that you see me doing that. A response. Here my talk diverges from what my original text was in 1998. That version ended with a somewhat strange segue into the role of demonic reading as found in William Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. But looking back after two decades, I'm not really satisfied with its conclusion. Today, I am inclined to think that the St. John's program can hold its own in the arena of the giants. We may be culturally conservative in the manner of Matthew Arnold, that Matthew Arnold would recognize, but we are certainly not authoritarian. The authors of our program argue too much with one another, and the college as an institution does not take sides. We prescribe what our students are to read, but we place no limits on what they are to think about what they read. For example, we require all of the students in our college to study Newton's Principia and the elementary techniques of calculus. But I believe that it is the special pride of St. John's College that more students here understand the calculus but do not believe in it than can be found anywhere else in the world. As for Wilsonian Western ascendancy, that charge is answered at least in part by the Eastern Classics program, which has operated in Santa Fe since the early 1990s, and which will be joined soon by the new Middle Eastern Classics program beginning next semester. Nor should an institution that aspires to an ahistorical stance toward the text it reads be embarrassed by the allegation that its own origins have historical antecedents. Everything has historical antecedents, if you care to look for them. That's no more paradoxical than noticing that a short-lived creature whose nervous system arose out of thousands of generations of messy organic evolution should aspire to discover, articulate, and understand timeless mathematical truths. Our human faculty for such speculation is amazing, and I don't think even Plato would have thought it less impressive if he had had the benefit of all the detailed knowledge of biology that we've discovered since his time. By rereading as I reread the 1998 version of this lecture, I was left with the uncomfortable feeling that in the end, I had dodged the question that I had set out to address. You heard that question about 40 minutes ago. Quote, did something happen between the 13th century and the 16th century that explains the move from Thomas's acceptance of Aristotelian thought to the moderns' dismissal of it? Posed in just those terms, the answer is simple. Yes, something must have happened, although what exactly it was is still obscure and is likely to remain obscure, at least for us, because as the question is stated, it's an historical question. It's a question for giants to investigate, and our seminar discussions cannot easily deal with it. However, we might do better if we worded the question a bit differently. What if we asked instead, How should the St. John's program respond to the claims of radical novelty made by authors in the early modern period, such as Hobbes, Galileo, and Bacon? Now the question is not about history, but is directly aimed at us. It asks, how do we respond if prominent participants in our great ahistorical conversation claim that older participants in that conversation have no right to be there? To that, we might answer glibly, every thoughtful viewpoint is part of the discussion, even those that question the foundation of the discussion itself. That answers the question, but not in a very satisfactory way. So let's try again to rephrase the question one more time. How, we might ask, can St. John's College's backward-looking curriculum deal with a field like the natural sciences, in which there is evident progress, and in which newer presentations conclusively supplant and replace earlier presentations? The natural sciences are singled out here because they display the most prominent evidence of progress. Natural scientists are among the least likely to spend time seriously retracing the arguments of their distant predecessors. Confronted with the question in this form, I moved to think about my experience in my senior laboratory last semester. In the last several sessions of that class, we deviated deliberately from the prescribed syllabus and read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That book, I thought, would provide an opportunity for the class to look back with a broad view at the entire experience of 3 years of laboratory classes. And we were not disappointed. The majority of examples that Kuhn considers were familiar to the students including the Copernican revolution in astronomy, Antoine Lavoisier's reformation of chemistry, and the advent of quantum mechanics. Kuhn's thesis is that science does not march steadily toward perfect understanding, but instead stumbles, alternating between extended periods of what he calls normal science on the one hand, and sudden scientific revolutions on the other. Ordinarily, in any given field of study, there is an accepted framework that determines what questions are worth asking and what research is worth pursuing. So, for example, in a Ptolemaic framework of astronomy, the question, how much does the planet Jupiter weigh, would not even be asked, because the planets are understood to be divine beings and not physical objects. In the Newtonian paradigm, which replaced it ultimately, the relative masses of the planets are definite quantities begging to be determined. Normal science continues in what Kuhn calls puzzle solving, guided by its paradigm as long as it is able. From time to time, however, intractable problems arise. So, for instance, just to pick an example at random, the odd relation between the frequency and intensity of glowing light from hot bodies, such as like light bulb filaments, is one such problem that could not be solved by the means available before 1900. Before, that is, Max Planck launched a new paradigm in physics, quantum mechanics. When an old paradigm appears unable to cope with new questions, a period of revolutionary change begins. Unsurprisingly, most of the episodes we focus on in our laboratory program are periods of scientific revolution. Revolutionary science is, generally speaking, more interesting science. It's in these moments that scientific heroes confront and overcome unexpected challenges. By contrast, normal science, as Kuhn talks about it, solving puzzles, looks dull. Nevertheless, although the periods of scientific revolution attract lots of attention, the times of normal science, which can last from dozens of years to dozens of centuries, are essential to giving science the appearance of constant progress. During these periods, puzzles are solved. Results are obtained that fit within the existing framework. The accumulation of those results don't actually demonstrate the correctness of the existing paradigm, but what they do is provide a collection of results that any new paradigm will have to somehow adapt itself to. So, for example, Einstein's special theory of relativity fundamentally rearranged the concepts of space, time, mass, and energy. But the deviations that it predicts from the Newtonian results had necessarily to diminish and disappear for all practical purposes in ordinary situations. They unnoticeable at speeds less than a noticeable fraction of the speed of light. Again, Bohr's stationary state electron orbitals around the hydrogen atom, which were fundamental to quantum mechanics, completely overturned Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic radiation. But those orbitals must necessarily approach and ultimately match Maxwell's theory when applied to electrons far from an atomic nucleus. If they didn't, we couldn't possibly explain how thousands of miles of telegraph cables, not to mention the radio industry, had managed to operate successfully under the old theory. Thus, the normal periods of science, boring as they are, guarantee that scientific work will seem to make progress. A new paradigm, when it comes, may last for years, maybe for decades, possibly for centuries. But when it gives way to a new paradigm, you can be sure that it will not go back to an earlier vision. There will be an enormous range of new results that it will have to conform to. It will conform. It will conform to them. The paradigms will not go backwards and will thus give the appearance, at least, of going forwards. I found Kuhn's book to be a useful occasion to review the laboratory from a broad perspective. So too did some of the students, but others did not. Those who were dissatisfied wanted to talk about things that Kuhn stubbornly refused to address, namely, whether the theories described were true or not. Truth is not a word that Kuhn uses. Instead, he contends that the crucial virtue for a new scientific paradigm is not whether that it should be true, but that it should be fertile. The key question does this paradigm provide many new questions for investigation and new lines for research? A new paradigm must solve the problem that precipitated it, but it does not necessarily need to solve every problem in its field. And in fact, for every new scientific paradigm, there is always a bucket labeled, "We'll get to that later." In fact, its incompleteness is in some measure a virtue, for Kuhn argues that if there were no unsolved problems remaining, what would the next generation of normal scientists do? The students had different ideas. They were increasingly interested in whether and in what ways the arcane scientific concepts that we had been talking about would intersect with their lives. More and more often we looked back at Bacon's observation that nature had to be tormented in order to give up its secrets. Tormenting nature didn't seem to be something that the students were deeply committed to. In fact, it was something that they were somewhat dubious about. The experiments on which the theories we were reading depended were increasingly extreme. For example, for example, there's a scientist telling us that this is what one sees when one purifies a gas, puts it into a glass tube at low pressure, subjects it to powerful electric currents, and stares at the resulting light through a diffraction grating at 10,000 lines per inch, and measures the angles of deflection of the colors that one sees. Now, there's a reasonable argument to be made that such a procedure, arcane as it is, and thousands of other tests that are just as extreme as this and more so, is the best way to understand what nature is. But when you step back a moment, questions begin to show up. I blame our freshman curriculum. I blame it for our students' grumbling dissatisfaction because it was in the freshman seminar and in the laboratory that students first encountered Aristotle's worldview. Whatever its drawbacks, perhaps the greatest virtue that Aristotle's vision had was its comprehensiveness. In Aristotle's understanding, everything in the world forms a great whole. The divine mover stands outside of space, imperturbable itself, but as the supreme intelligible being, or as Dante would have it, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altra stelle, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Its influence filters through the natures of all beings, down to the growth of plants and to the proper ordering of human lives in accordance with our highest virtues. Aristotle's vision is beautiful. Bohr's vision and Newton's vision are useful. However beautiful it is, its beauty does not alter the fact that Aristotelian theories of motion did not help the Venetian artillerymen who wanted to predict where their cannonballs would strike. Galileo's new science of projectile motion did that. It began to fill that need, and the paradigm of Newtonian dynamics worked better still and provided guidance for many new research projects that speak to questions posed by the 17th and 18th century military-industrial complex. Practical results were gained, philosophical inclusiveness was sacrificed. The new sciences produced wonderful answers for their problems, but they did so by abandoning the effort to deal with questions about humanity, divinity, and the purpose of, well, anything really. These issues found themselves at the bottom of the "we'll get to that later" bucket, which was left almost entirely undisturbed. To make room for this narrow and lopsided vision, philosophers segregated human concerns from thought about the physical world. Descartes gave us a strict dualism that separated the world of thought from that of extended world of things. Leibniz gave us a divine pre-established harmony between the thoughts of the monads and the actions that corresponded to them, but which were not really caused by them in the outer world. Both of these schemes are more than a little bit nutty, but in the 17th century, no one seemed to have any better alternative to suggest. My students didn't say that they wanted to return to Aristotle. The particulars of Aristotle's works had failed too often. Newtonian dynamics does do a better job with cannonballs and planetary motion. William Harvey had more to say about the motion of the blood, and sometimes something like the atoms of Leucippus, Democritus, and Lucretius seemed more like the precursors of Dalton's and Lavoisier's chemical elements than anything Aristotle had to offer. Still, the senior laboratory seemed aware that the intricacies of physics, chemistry, and biology that they had been studying had been gained by trading away the wholeness of vision that, for all its limitations, was aesthetically and morally significant. Although the students couldn't have Aristotle back again, their nostalgia for a unified vision of the world manifested itself in an intensified interest in the works of Henri Bergson and Hans Jonas. With these experiences in mind, how does our question now appear? We could rephrase it one more time. How did it come about that success with problems involving inanimate nature was deemed more important than maintaining a unified understanding of humanity and the world? A host of possible answers swarm up. Was it a matter of advancing technology, putting engineering ahead of philosophy in the popular imagination? Should we point to the growth of mercantile capitalism undermining social structures that have been aligned with the old philosophical order? Can we blame the Protestant Reformation? A lot of people like to do that. Was it the European discovery of America that opened the minds to the possibility the world was radically different than had been previously thought? I've seen an account that points to the great comet of 1577 as the world-shattering revelation that the old ideas of how the world was made out of impenetrable crystal shells could not possibly be right. These are guesses, these are speculations, and there are many more like them. We've been there before. We've fallen back again into the gigantic form of questioning that is to one appropriate to the giants in the great gigantomachia. Naturally, to a gigantic question, we get gigantic answers, which in our ahistorical seminar table have little purchase. So let's try to formulate the question one more time. Could we instead ask, is a unified understanding that embraces both the physical and chemical world on the one hand and the human moral world on the other even possible? This is not an historical question. It is a perennial question. Back in his book about scientific revolutions, Kuhn argues that paradigms of thought answer, he says, questions like, what are the fundamental entities of which the world is composed? How do these entities interact with one another, and in what senses? The Aristotelian understanding holds that the fundamental entities of the world are beings, things that have natures that define what they are. Some beings are inanimate, others are animate, some few are rational and are endowed with the capacity for thought, but all of them share the motivation to flower into the fullest expression of what they are. The mechanical paradigm of the early modern era takes a very different view of the extended natural world. The fundamental things in this dispensation are not beings, but masses that are pushed about by other masses and have no particular interest in what they may become. Somehow, Beside or alongside or in some sort of association with them, there may be mental or spiritual objects. But how those things relate to the physical stuff is always an obscure question. Some philosophical and religious views try to reassure their adherents that their lives are not ultimately bound to the physical bodies that belong to them, but the fervor of those reassurances betrays the shakiness of confidence behind them. I've been speaking as if the ancient world all shared the unified Aristotelian vision and that the mechanical philosophy was new in the 17th century. But that's not really the case. The ancients were familiar with the idea that the material world might be essentially dead, and that thinking, acting humans, that is, persons, are always a fragile possibility whose existence in that hostile material world always teeters on the edge of impossibility. The status of living, thinking, feeling, and acting creatures in that world is largely, if not entirely, in a world that is largely, if not entirely, dominated by mindless laws of necessity, is a perennial question. It has always been with us. We have read Lucretius. We've heard in the Phaedo how Socrates was disappointed that Anaxagoras' world, supposedly ordered by mind, had very little actual thought in it. But the dark possibility that the world in which life is essentially a stranger appears for our students first and most dramatically in the Iliad. The battlefield, the strong encounter, is a space where warriors challenge each other to determine whether one might not reduce the other to an inanimate thing. Here I'm following Simone Weil. The true hero, she says, the true subject, the center of the Iliad, is force. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. In this work, the Iliad, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. To define force, she continues, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing, in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse out of him. Somebody was here, the next minute, nobody is here. This is a spectacle the Iliad never wearies of showing us. End quote. From the beginning, or at least from early on, people asked, are human persons at home in the natural world? Are we of the same kind as the other beings among whom we live? Do all of them, like us, strive to express their natures as we also do? Or are we strange, alien intrusions in a world dominated by mindless force, incomprehensible entities that somehow bestride a mysterious gulf and are always in danger of finding ourselves reduced to mere matter by age, by disease, or by the pitiless bronze? That perennial question did not suddenly arise in the 17th century, although somehow it became nuclearly urgent when we discovered that we could achieve great feats of engineering and discovery by treating the world as populated by dead masses. At St. John's College, we may not be in the best position to describe all the influences that led this question to take center stage in the modern world, but our ahistorical perspective situates us well to consider what the question means. One hour, exactly.